And then this begins. And it goes something like Shuddho si buddho si niranjanosi sansara maya parivarjitosi sansara swapnam tyajya moha nidram madala solla panuvacha putram. Alright. Hello and welcome to another episode of Three Faced. I'm Anuraj and I have with me Dylan and Chetan. Today we'll be going deep into an ancient Indian meditation technique known as Vipassana. Whoops. But before that, how are you guys? How you been?
I've been good, man.
Yeah.
Well, we just came off a 3-day meditation retreat, so feeling pretty
That's
elated.
the premise for the
at
podcast.
The moment. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm good. Feeling great. Yeah, a lot of emotions, unprocessed emotions, but a lot of things. Yeah.
Let's process them today.
Let's do it. Let's go right
Let's
in.
process.
So I want to give a bit of a background to Vipassana, but also Buddhism in general. And so, the viewers have a bit of an understanding of the context in which the Buddha was operating. And so that will help them understand the key principles and the insights that Vipassana actually tries to inculcate in the practitioner. The Buddha was born around 300 to 400 BC in what is now Nepal. But at the time, it was just one continuous geographical region in India at the time. And the dominant philosophy of the society had been, for more than 1,000 years, for a few thousand years at that point, Vedic. And the early Vedic religion, what we now know as the Rig Veda and the texts that follow it, can be split into four things. So you have the early literature, which is the Samhitas. Then you have the Brahmanas, the Aranyakas, and the Upanishads. The very early Vedic text was very outward-facing. It was a very outward-facing religion. It was very much sacrifice to the gods to get some kind of boon for yourself. So the sacrificer would sacrifice various things in front of the altar of fire, and invocations would be made to the various different Vedic deities, and the result of that would be, I want more milk, I want more progeny, I want more riches, I want more cows, I want more land.
A good crop season or something.
A good crop season, exactly. I want material benefits to me, my family, and my people. This formed the earliest layer of the Vedic literature. After that, you have a layer called the Brahmanas. This has nothing to do with the jati or the caste identity. This portion of the text was an explanation of the earlier literature, written by the descendants of the families where the actual early poets came from. The third section, this is now a few hundred years later. So we're starting somewhere around 2000 BC, and we're coming to now around 700 years later by this point. The third section is known as the Aranyakas. Aranyaka in Sanskrit means forest. So a few people from this society started looking inwards. They started venturing into the forests, and they started going inwards in their meditative and spiritual practices as well. And so the literature that came about during this period is comprised in the Aranyakas. After that is the Upanishads. So once that period is complete, you have a better synthesis of the more metaphysical concepts of what we now refer to as Hinduism in general. But this formed the background in which all Indian faith systems either accept or provide a different interpretation on. So concepts like Rita, the cosmic order which exists, Dharma, Karma, and all other things like Atma, Brahman, all these things come later on in the Upanishads. The Buddha Dharma has a few takes on some of these principles. So it will have an interpretation on Dharma, it will have an interpretation on Atma. Specifically, in the context in which the Buddha operated, there were differing views. You had a very eternalist view, which was the view of the Upanishads, and you had basically non-permanence view, which was the view of other sects that existed at the time. So you can think of this as The eternalist view is that the Atma, also known, you could also think of it as the soul in a slightly different context, but the identity, the self, the feeling of I beyond the ego is something that is permanent. Whereas the non-permanent schools of thought, which was the other extreme, were saying that there is no personal continuity at all. The individual comes about purely by happenstance. One moment we exist and the next we don't. A good way to understand this is, if there was a question, am I the same self now as I was in a previous life? The eternalist would say yes, but the permanent person would say no. The Buddhist way is somewhere in the middle. That's why Bodh Dharma, as it is known in the Indian context, is known as Madhya path, which means the middle path, the middle way. And so in the Buddha's concept of the world, he actually proposed not fully eternalist and a not fully non-permanent view as well. So to give a bit of a quick summary of the Buddha's view is, there is suffering and death in the world, and to get over this, you have to get over your sense of attachment to the world and to get to a state of nirvana. But what is that? Are you becoming a sense fully impermanent? You're not. Are you fully giving away and just accepting that life has no meaning at all? No. The Buddha's Dharma says that there are constantly changing elements which make up every individual, everything, and these things are rupa, vedana, sanya, sanskar, and vijnana. So the body, feelings, perception, karmic content, and your consciousness. None of these can be considered the impermanent Atma of the Upanishads, because the Atma is permanent. Yet all of these are always impermanent. Our bodies change, our feelings change from time to time, our perception of what's happening around us. If we're in a bad mood, a happy incident that's happening around us might be perceived as unhappy to the person that is perceiving it. This changes. Our karmic content is constantly changing. Every time we take an action, we're changing our state from what it used to be. And our consciousness, our sense of I, is also always changing. So that is the Buddha's perception of the anatta, the anatma, the non-permanence. Vipassana is a technique that takes you through all of these things that does cause attachment in the individual, and tries to find a way to break these bonds while still accepting the realities of life. That was a bit of a long whirlwind, but
Well
hopefully,
said.
Bring us back to scratch,
bring us back to bring it back around.
Yeah.
The whole reason for this podcast is because Dylan and Chetan here have been recently to a Vipassana retreat. So we thought, why not dig into this concept a little bit? So my first question for you guys is, how was the retreat? Where was it? Who held it? And tell us a little bit about your experiences.
Cool. Yeah, I'll kick off. So basically, this was a 3-day retreat. So a little bit of context with Vipassana, they do 10-day retreats normally, but we actually did a 3-day retreat together. This was held at Dhammapada, and which is based out in Hawkesbury. They have locations all over across the world, but we did this in so Lower Portland, and it was a very, very interesting experience, I will say. Doing it with a friend, and then being able to kind of like reconcile that with my own sense of self as well. What about you, Chad?
Yeah, it was definitely interesting, to say the least. So I guess just a bit of background on what Vipassana, I guess how it works. So when you first do it, it's a 10-day silent retreat. So you're not allowed to talk. And they take that silence to another level when you're not allowed to speak, but it's also body language. You're not allowed to look at each other or interact with each other. So it's very, as Anuraj was saying, very much going internal, going within yourself, and they're trying to limit any kind of external stimulation. And that includes kind of reading journaling, yoga, and other kind of exercises. So you're really trying to shut off a lot of the sensory inputs you normally get in our day-to-day lives, which especially in our current lives these days, I feel like there is a lot of, just with our phones in our pocket. That alone creates so much noise. So being away from technology, especially, I think for me, was just that in itself was such a I think cleansing experience. But then on top of that, the 3 days is full. The 10 days originally is jam-packed full of meditation instructions. It's not just kind of the same thing every day. You're kind of learning something new each day, and it kind of the technique unfolds more and more. The day starts from 4 a.m. usually, and it goes till 9 p.m. at night, and it's filled with roughly 10 hours of meditation in that time. And there's some really nice meals that you get as well. And at night there's like a discourse that you watch, which is like a mini Netflix episode, which kind of explains the theory around it as well. So I guess today we're going to be talking a bit about our experiences and stuff, but also we're a bit mindful that we don't want to spoil too much about it, because one of the best advices I got around this is it's better to not know too much coming in, and come in with like a blank slate and no expectations, because I think then you're able to appreciate it a bit better. So I guess this is maybe a spoiler warning for someone who is maybe considering to go soon, to maybe maybe just go ahead
skip
with
this one.
Skip this episode, or go ahead with caution.
We'll put some times.
We told you so.
Yeah,
maybe tune in at the end, or like we'll tell you the timestamp to dial back in on. But yeah, I guess.
What about people who haven't? So maybe I'll take this to Dylan. What about people who've never thought about Vipassana, or never thought about meditative techniques at all? Why is this experience worth doing? Why is Vipassana worth it?
Right, that's a really good question, actually. I think for a lot of us, the journey is different, but the vicissitudes are always the same. I think it goes for anyone in life. You've always got hard things that you go through, and regardless of where you are in life, you deal with it in different ways. But I think what's a uniform constant is the fact that misery is a state of being which kind of exists for us to be able to deal with it. And I think that's where meditation kind of comes into the foray of it, because, we're traditionally known that, meditation, reduces anxiety, calms stress, does all of these things. But I think what it really does is it kind of really gives a practical solution in that framework, where I think is Vipassana. I think modern day meditation is like a bit skewed in that front, and I think Vipassana gives you a very scientific, a very practical framework for you to be able to explore your own body, your own journey, and your own sensations, following the framework which is universal in the front, but still like being able to finding the solution in life, and being able to then be at true peace with it. I think that's a trait that only life can teach you, and how you deal with it kind of does. So from the perspective of someone who hasn't done it before, looking into your internal world is kind of taking a step into darkness and not knowing what comes out of it. But I think it's one of the bravest things you can do, because it's taking that understanding that you have an accountability, and you can, you have an accountability for the way you react to your emotions, and you can regulate and understand what that is for what it is.
Have either of you found that after going to Vipassana, or after doing this retreat, that you are less reactive to stimulation, or once you come back, it's like an extreme amount of overstimulation?
Yeah, I think there's a bit of both. So I think there's two questions there. I think there's the first day back, I always find that there's quite a lot of overstimulation. Just even like checking your phone for the first time, it's just like suddenly being hit by so many things, and it's like, whoa, you need to slow it down. But the second point is also true. I found the less reactive thing is true. Your
much more in the moment, present. But it's one of those things where Vipassana is not like an end all. Like it teaches you the practice, and then the onus is kind of back on you to continue that practice. And the longer you continue that for, the longer you'll retain that kind of ability to not react right away and have that control. But that kind of glow will fade away when you stop practicing. So
I always find that like ever when you're interacting with someone, especially when it gets a little bit heated, especially in like the context of family, the best thing you can do is to be non-reactive. And I think practicing that in key moments like that, when you're having like maybe an argument with anyone that you're close to, it really helps. But going back to the actual retreat, what is it like not speaking for? So this was a retreat that you guys did for 3 days, but you've also done one that's 10 days. I've never not spoken for 10 days. I don't speak much generally, but I've never not spoken for 10 days. So what's that like?
Yeah, I think for me, it was quite a challenge, especially like being super extroverted. Like it's just my second nature too. I think it's maybe just a way I process my emotions and just kind of articulate my thoughts as well to just speak. So it was quite confronting that I wasn't able to do that. There's like an hour every day where you're allowed to kind of go to the teacher and just like ask your Q&A. And in the first 10 days,
so you can speak
just for that like little consultation that you have. And it's like a one-on-one that you do. And
Guru Shishya, master student.
Yeah, exactly. Just
like,
that dynamic. And like in the first 10-day course I did, I found myself every day I was showing up to that with like some random questions that I would have like 5 or 6 questions I'd be firing. And some degree they were genuine questions, but I kind of found that a lot of the reason I was doing that was just to have some sort of human interaction. And it was only in the 5th day when I realized I was like, oh, this is another attachment, another craving I have. The whole purpose of this course is to let go of these. And then when I did, I found that I benefited from that by having a bit of that solitude. How did you find that, Dylan?
I thought it really interesting because I think one thing that I've kind of like come to understand about Vipassana is that like it was an extension of kind of like learning to recognize my breath. And learning to recognize my breath meant that I wasn't just one with reactions. And so then kind of being able to then realize, being in a situation where you have 10 days, 3 days, however long this is, it doesn't really like change anything. Because at the end of the day, what happens is like, you're put in a different situation. You put yourself into an environment. You follow the rules. It's very like structured in that front. Like there's not a lot of guesswork because a lot of what the technique and what things are is very simple. So like you inevitably follow it because you're allowing yourself to understand something about yourself that you don't even know exists yet. So for me, it was like, I think it was super comforting because it meant that like I could then give myself the permission to just be like, okay, like let me just purely tune into the sensory aspect of what this is. Let me purely tune into the concentration aspect of this. Because I think one thing as well,
you have the time.
Yeah, exactly. You have the time, but you also have all these the rules and the way that these things are put in place. It makes it easy for you to kind of like just say, okay, like I will observe these rules and I will do these rules, and you'll learn to work with it in that sense. So it's not as overly difficult. Like my personal experience was that I didn't find it as overly difficult because I was already going through a bit of an observant phase. So it was a bit more of an extension to be able to like kind of then realize that it's okay to see, to observe and surrender myself to those rules.
Stripping away the noise, stripping away, I guess, all the inputs that you get from interacting with other people, from viewing screens, watching things, and mulling over certain things that you might have just, taken in from your senses. How does, what remains after all of that?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. What remains when you strip out the noise? Like, I think what is taken away is that ego, that sense of self that you kind of developed. It's like a layer that we as humans have developed to kind of survive in a society. It's a kind of this like this idea of who I am, which is informed by all my interactions, and then this thing of I got to be consistent with who I was yesterday, and then all these layers like an onion, you keep adding on top of that, and then in these 10 days when you're kind of away from all that, you're peeling back all these layers and kind of going back to that essence of the self that you are.
But we learned earlier that the entire basis of the Bauddha Dharma is that there is no essence of the self, like anatma. It doesn't exist. So going back to just what you said just then, the thing I found really interesting was keeping up the identity, the ego that you had yesterday. Does Vipassana make it more fluid? Does Vipassana help you express yourself a bit more fluidly? So maybe you might think of yourself as a particular way. You might think of yourself as a software engineer. But going away and realizing that this is an adopted identity, do you now feel a little bit more open to saying, I could technically be anything else?
I think the course itself, it kind of frays away from these kind of philosophical doctrines that, you talked about, that the Buddha had this middle way. And the way I kind of see it, the Buddha might have had a middle way because he didn't actually have a hard answer for either. Like the answer could be one or the other. But Vipassana is kind of, it's not sectarian, it's not theistic, or it doesn't require an answer, is I guess what I'm trying to say. It kind of is just more looking, it's using the body as a framework to kind of explore these attachments, like the concept of these attachments, which, like if you just think of the general philosophy of Buddhism is that all life, all existence is suffering. Suffering comes from attachments. And to get rid of suffering, get rid of these attachments. And to get rid of attachments, meditate. But then, exactly what do we do? Like, how does meditation get rid of attachments? And that's Vipassana provides that, like, that pathway of doing that. And it does that by kind of recognizing that attachments, the suffering is coming from, these attachments to cravings or aversions, right? You have a craving for something which is not met and you suffer, or you have an aversion to something and that happens and then you suffer, right? And then what it basically does is helping you build this thing called equanimity. And being equanimous means that you're not reacting to those attachments.
So how do you deal with them finally? Because you can't just be completely non-motionless for the rest of your life.
Yeah, so I think that's the thing I'm probably still, I guess, working through, because I think Vipassana is actually made more for like kind of monks who are on the path to enlightenment, who are like, I think that there is, it's framed in a way that it's kind of also made for the householder, as they call it, which is like the layman like us, who's still kind of on that road. But I think the end state is, how I see it, is to kind of full renunciation of kind of letting go. So in that sense, it is kind of saying, well, eventually you're going to have to let go of all attachment to this material body, material world, all of it, because you're transcending it to something bigger.
I just want to like add to this kind of like really interesting train of thought, which is like zoom out for a little bit, because I think the way that I think about it is that there is this material plane and there's a metaphysical plane, right? We're all comprised of atoms at the end of the day. We're all comprised of atoms, right? So like when I think when I think of Vipassana, I think of it like this, right? With our life, we only understand the concept of ego, which is our attachment to the world around us, as opposed to anything that exists within, right? We don't see within. We have a feeling of what is within, but we only see what we externally see, right? So when I think of Vipassana, I think it's an invitation to essentially look inwards to understand the truth of the reality of the universe as it is. Now, when I think of that, when I say that, what I mean by that is that like you're able to then actually, I think the biggest thing for me is that it's being able to come to terms with the truth that there is a concept called separate togetherness, which is that a lot of people have ego dissonance or aren't able to come to the facts that like their ego is torn, because whenever we have any traumatic events or anything that causes a difference in our beliefs of the material plane, then effectively it creates a different like perception of it, right? But we often lose track of, you know, like our reality in that front. So I think what it does is that it's not like, my take on Vipassana is that it's not encouraging anyone to just not do anything and to not understand anything. It's to literally be like, this is the material plane, this is the metaphysical plane, this is the worlds that you operate in. And then when you understand that, then you can operate in a world that's more harmonious to what your outcomes and the things that you want to do.
Yeah, it's actually it's very nicely put, and very clearly I can see that your takeaway from the experience is slightly different from Chetan's takeaway from the experience. And that goes back to what Chetan said earlier, in the sense that Vipassana it doesn't push a particular narrative of the metaphysical and the material on the individual. It gives the individual tools to be able to perceive them, and then allows the individual to form their own conclusions on each of them. So going back to what you said, Chetan, earlier, you said there were two ways that suffering... oops, call from mom.
Gotta cancel it.
Yeah.
That's the real aversions there.
He thought about it. He was like, should I pick up this call? You know what? Next time, just put her on the podcast.
The root of Anuraj is suffering.
Like, what do you think about this? Yeah.
Sorry, you were about to say. So two forms.
Yeah, so there's two forms of suffering. So it's attachments and aversions.
Yes.
And I realized that we should have introduced this a little bit better in the beginning. Vipassana is essentially mindfulness. Mindfulness, meditation, and Vipassana are synonyms. They're not synonyms, but they are essentially... Mindfulness meditation is an adaptation of Vipassana in sort of the Anglosphere. And so when Chet was talking about the two modes of suffering, the two sources of suffering, the attachments and aversions, Vipassana teaches you to be mindful of these things so you can understand your own reactionary behavior and then make a more informed action and not something that is impulse.
Yeah, that's right. I think to my earlier point, like, even though I think it feels like the kind of end goal of Vipassana is that kind of full liberation from suffering and you know, detachment of you know, that soul or whatever from the material body and world. Even until then, there's a lot of benefits to be felt, and like how you just described that mindfulness element, like you're building firstly awareness of your own kind of inherent reactions and attachments and aversions that you have, right? So by even just that first step and that understanding, that alone just gives you a lot of mental clarity that helps you make better decisions in certain moments, right? For example, like one thing I've found personally is like, I realize that I sometimes get quite hangry in situations where I haven't eaten and stuff in a while. Like I'm quite like cranky and frustrated. And this happened even today, like, and this is post Vipassana. I was like, you know, I hadn't had lunch on time and I was kind of getting restless. And it was a thing where normally I lean into that and I just get frustrated at the people around me and just kind of let that emotion consume me. But post Vipassana, I was like, okay, wait, this is really an attachment, like a craving I have for food right now. Like I can, like, yes, I know my body needs that and I will get it. But by becoming consumed by this, it prevents me having the mental clarity right now to actually make the right decisions to act, right? So I think to kind of sum up what I'm saying is there's everyone's experience of Vipassana will probably be very different. It's a very individual journey and everyone will get different benefits from it. But I guess in terms of the first question, like, you know, why should anyone do it? It's hard to answer that. Like for me, it was my first, when I did the 10-day, it was just like, I want to challenge myself. I want to try something different, and everyone says that this is a very difficult thing, but you'll be better for it. And I can say this.
Most things are like that.
Yeah, nothing good comes easy, and it's like, you know, a long dark tunnel, and you just have to trust people like me and Dylan who have done it to say that, you know, you'll come out better on the other end, even though it'll be painful along the way. So that alone was enough of a reason for me, but I feel like there is just countless benefits you can get more clarity and mental kind of peace, kind of working through a lot of I guess past issues and trauma, or like blocks that you have in your life. You're kind of almost just forced to spend time with yourself. Even if you set aside the Vipassana, just you're forced to just confront your thoughts and deepest kind of emotions. On that note, we might take a short, quick intermission before continuing with the rest of the podcast.
Yep. Maybe you can return that mama call, you know? Like
let Anuraj call his mom.
Gotta do what you gotta do.
He's got priorities. He's
priorities, man. Only love us better, my mama.
Yeah.
He's a householder.
I'm a householder. I'm a measly householder.
Get this guy out of here, bro.
Who
gave this guy a microphone? Get it.
Jesus, man.
Yeah, cool.
All right. Be right back.
Welcome back. Welcome back to the Three Face Podcast. We're now doing second half, round 2, Vipassana. What is it? What is Bodhidharma? What is enlightenment? Dylan, what is enlightenment?
Okay, so I can't ever preach to know what enlightenment is, but I have this feeling, this gut feeling that for me, enlightenment is this idea where you can truly be able to observe the true nature of everything in that particular moment for what it is, and be in that state. So like what I think is interesting about enlightenment, and the way that I think Western story, I think there is a bit of a Western influence into it. Like we've kind of posited enlightenment from a story narration perspective, because enlightenment in that context seems to be finite, you know, like it's the final goal, it's the liberation stage. You hit that and then it's done. Like life, like there's no what happens after. But I think the thing with Vipassana, it teaches you that like there is after, because everything is constantly changing. It's never just like this is it and that's it. Like that's the Western style of understanding how we do things. Like
So what you're saying is very, it's reminiscent for me for, it reminds me of, what's his name, Devdutt Patnayak's book, My Gita. In that he talks about two kinds of narratives about society and about humans. It is a finality narrative where there is a definite goal and an indefinite finality. And one of the most eye-opening takeaways from reading that book is that in the Mahabharata, the section in which the Bhagavad Gita is recited to the section to which the Bhagavad Gita is recited to Arjun. So Sri Krishna says the Bhagavad Gita to Arjun right before the war of the Mahabharata begins, right? But in that moment is an inspired moment. What you're talking about. Later on in the Gita, Arjun says, much later on in the Gita, when Krishna is just about to leave for Dwarka after the war, after everything, Arjun says to Krishna, can you tell me the Bhagavad Gita again? And Krishna says to Arjun, is like, no, that was an inspired, enlightened moment. But then he does follow it up with the Anugita, which is like a different, elongated version of the Gita, which is not quite the same thing. So even then, they recognize this impermanence of these inspired moments.
Interesting.
Very well put, I'd say.
I think, yeah. So like on that note, it's like, I think what has kind of I've been touching on earlier is that like, just understanding that to be able to recount that experience for the human mind to be able to compute it, it requires there to be a definite structure to it. But if you're entering the realm of Vipassana, you understand that there is no structure to anything. It's just chaos. And
it's perception. So I think what we talked about earlier was that it's not of the mind. That's why people throw around words like the truth, the ultimate reality, universal consciousness. And most, like, even me, a lot of the times when I hear these gurus talk about these things, I'm like, what is the truth? Clearly, when we think about the truth, there is something very tangible that we say, this happened, this is the truth. It's sense perception truth, but this is not of the senses.
Yes.
Because this is not of the mind.
Yes.
Therefore, I have a theory where almost all Indian Bharatiya Panths, their different various dharmas, they all essentially start with some figures that have this level insight or this kind of a yogic experience. And then from there, they try to create a framework to explain that yogic experience within the framework of language, within the framework of the mind, something that other people can understand. But again and again, actually, if you realize this, we know that these faith systems, they don't really preach belief all that much at all. They're all experience-based.
Exactly.
All the practices, all the spiritual practices are generally always experience-based. And therefore, they always lead the practitioner, trying to get the practitioner to walk the path of the guru.
Yes.
To have the experiences themselves rather than intellectualize those experiences.
Yeah.
I have the same view. I think, I think the question of what is enlightenment, I don't think we can ever put to words. I think it's beyond human comprehension. Like, I think I probably subscribe to more what we described at the start of the podcast as that eternalistic kind of school of thought, where there's like this, you call it soul, consciousness, whatever, Atma, that exists within us, that's like our inherent self, and that's, going through the cycle of birth and death, and this process of liberation that, the Buddha's set out is one of many parts, I think, but this is just maybe the most easily implementable, I think, for the average person. Most accessible, like, do X, Y, Z and this will happen, rather than necessarily read all the texts and meditate on them and dwell on it and maybe you'll find something. It's kind of like, do X, Y, Z, and what will happen then is that soul, you're ending all the attachments. You're liberating from attachments, and in my mind, what that means is you're literally freeing that consciousness or that soul from this material body, from this material world. And what that means is then, by having that consciousness out of there, you're no longer limited to perception just from the senses that we have in this body. You're able to perceive the whole material world in all other ways as well.
But sorry to interrupt. I just wanted to ask, like, then in that vein, like, touching on what we both said, like, entering Vipassana is about reducing and removing all attachment. But then in the same vein, then why do we have these teachers who then develop what I think is that attachment to show that, like to say, like, this is a framework, this is what you need to understand. Surely there must be some form of craving, or there must be something that exists for someone to think to themselves, like,
so this is the way it works, right? There are the concept. There is the sthula sharir and the sukshma sharir. The sthula sharir is the material body, the sthula, the physical body. Yep. And the sukshma, which means the finer, that is this essence that we're talking about, something greater, something metaphysical. Now you can apply this not just to the individual, but also to the society. For the human being to experience this, he must first go through the learnings within a contextual framework within the society. There is also, if you realize, dharma is not just limited to like spiritual dharma. Dharma exists at the level of the individual, at the level of the family, at the level of the society. Therefore, you need to have something that functions. You cannot constantly be in the enlightened state. However, you have to keep the enlightened state in mind for you to keep doing what you have to do dispassionately. And I don't mean that in the sense that I'm not really into what I'm doing. I mean in the sense that you're not attached to the outcome.
So you're
saying outcome independent.
Are you saying then it becomes more of like a duty or like a responsibility to sustaining life in that front, as opposed to then, like, when you understand death, then you can support life? Is that what I'm trying to understand here? Because if you're dispassionately doing that, then you're essentially
when I'm saying dispassionately, I mean, I don't, as I said before, I don't mean in the sense of I'm not interested in what I'm doing.
No, of course.
I'm saying it in the sense of outcome independent.
Yeah, exactly. Like, but that's what it is, right? You're creating purely for the sake of creating, right? Because you have witnessed what pure destruction looks like, and in doing so, then then I think like what
do you mean by pure destruction?
Like, okay, so
I don't necessarily think that like the experience is purely chaotic, and it's purely like it's incomprehensible in terms of words. But it's not destructive.
I want to like emphasize that like destructive isn't in the same context of the way that like it's not a negative thing, right? But when I say destructive, I mean dissolution, right? So by dissolving this entire structure of what this is, we are killing or we are destroying what our understanding of this structure is, right? So in the same vein, when we are enlightened, then we're able to at least understand death, I feel, or the dissolution that has existed or that has occurred as a result of that. So that's what I'm thinking is like in terms of Vipassana, because you're not killing, but you're observing, which is removing, effectively killing your attachment to these things that would naturally occur around you in that front. And I think that's where I think is interesting is that like as you were saying before, like, you know, like as I was saying before, like when you go, like you don't know
to what extent that I think, let me take your position that you had before I answered the last time. To what extent is this beneficial for the growth of the individual if you can take this to the absolute extreme and say that you as a concept, Dylan as a concept, Anuraj as a concept, Chetan as a concept, don't really exist. And I'll back this up with like a verse from the Markandeya Puran. There's a couplet in which there's a queen named Queen Madalasa. I hope I pronounced it correctly. She has a son, right? And then the namkaran for the son is about to happen. And the son is chilling, and the king gives the son a name. And as soon as the king gives the son a name, the namkaran, by the way, is the naming ceremony. It happens a few months or a few years after the person is born, depending on which time frame we're existing in. As soon as the king gives the son a name, the son starts crying. And then this begins. And it goes something like, Shuddho si buddho si niranjanosi, sansara maya parivarjitosi, sansara swapnam tyajya moha nidram, madala solla panuvacha putram. This is my absolute favorite. Like, if you want to say it a mantra, if you want to say it like a prayer, it's not really a prayer or a mantra. It's just
that was beautiful.
It's just thank you.
It was still nice to hear.
Thank you. But you should. I will link it we'll link like the actual recitation of this at the bottom. Anyway, the point is the translation goes like this: why are you crying? This sound, this name is just a sound that is attached to you. You are pure, conscious, and taintless. Don't cry at this name before this is just a sound that is attached to you. Right? So if you take this to the absolute extreme, which is to say that everything that you've thought about as me is just really it's the creation of it's the adoption of the things that you've like taken on over the years. It need not be so. It could be entirely different. Like I could be you, you could be me, Chet could be you. You know, like each individual body experiences the same sorts of things.
Yeah.
And our attachments to who we are essentially meaningless, because going back to Chet's take on what happened after Vipassana was there is this unchanging reality, the Atma, that pervades the universe.
Yes.
And that's like, you can't prove that. That's just like a feeling.
That is yeah.
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 And so how is that like useful?
Because if you think about it, right, then in the same vein, it's like that's what I think truth is. I feel like truth is that, right? Where you can accept that as being the condition of life, and then everything else is understandable and can be like worked in that framework of what we consider to be what is truth, right? So that's what I'm trying to say here, is that like understanding that life is a flux, and understanding that after we die that there will be a specimen that will continue to go through the same evolution, the same genesis of the same process that we go through. It's just that we don't get to witness that, we don't get to understand that, but at least we get to be
we get to glimpse it.
We get to glimpse it because we get to be the ones who choose, the choice to be able to choose whether we want to dissolve this structure or not. And I want to kind of like allude to this point here, where it's like, it's a bit of a modern day take, but essentially like Oppenheimer, if we want to use that, right? Oppenheimer essentially was the father of the modern day atomic bomb, right? But Oppenheimer wasn't actually the one who discovered the process of nuclear fission. It was actually discovered by German scientists. And the Germans actually had the knowledge to be able to undertake that, and they could have won the war with that. But the Germans, a big reason, and a lot of the physicists said this, the reason why they didn't actually end up like doing it is because they felt a moral obligation to not actually undertake that.
Okay. Just going to history.
Yep.
Didn't the Americans do it because they thought the Germans were already doing it?
Yeah, so they completely overestimated that in that front.
Okay.
But still, in the same vein, that the Germans still, if they wanted to pull all their resources together and they wanted to actually like, you know, undergo this way, they would have won it. They would have done it, because like all Oppenheimer did was he realized that like there were accredited scientists who had actually discovered this process, because he had been trying for so long. He was a theoretical physicist. He didn't actually delve in the concept of experimental physics, right? But the fact is that the Germans discovered this, right? And they found this, and they decided that no, we weren't going to actually undergo this, right? In mindset, in philosophy, in being, right? But Oppenheimer was the one. I mean, it wasn't just Oppenheimer, but it was the collective of that idea. It's like, okay, we're going to do this. We're going to make the choice to destroy. And that's why America is the superpower that it is today, because they were the ones who chose that despite all the possible consequences, despite everything, it doesn't matter what it is, we're going to destroy the fabric of our understanding of what the world is like. And despite anything, it's the way that it is now because of that. And I think that's where I want to like kind of like talk about, is that like, you know, once you destroy something, it is destroyed. Like once consciousness has been discovered, then you can no longer go back to this state of ignorance, because ignorance has been ruptured, right? A virgin can no longer be a virgin because the virgin has essentially like left that
controversial
state. I used to think the hymen would grow back.
But like,
put it out
even despite that, like in any function, like if you believe that even if you choose not to believe it, if something has been broken and it is broken, then it can never be brought, like a teacup, you drop a teacup and then you will never be able to get it to its original form.
Excuse me, have you seen Tenet?
No, I haven't actually.
Oh, that's why you don't.
But there's also the Japanese art of, I think it's like kintsugi or something, where they put teacups back together with the gold in between it, and that's like,
but
product.
on that point, you've created a new form. You haven't created
the essentially saying is entropy always rises, disorder increases.
Exactly.
Yes,
like
the number of possible states, the log of number of possible states. They can't go back.
Exactly. Like we can't go back to a time and be like, oh, like nuclear fission doesn't exist, and like no, like we don't, like now that we have this knowledge, every other person is now armed with like nuclear atomic bombs to essentially detonate each other.
So then should what? Okay, I want to give you a hypothetical, because I know this is something you're dying to answer. What would life be like? What would the world be like if everyone was in some sense enlightened? If everyone had that experience of consciousness once. So they know it exists, they know it's possible, they can't go back. What is the vision for the world?
It's probably a better place, right? A utopia.
What next? Is a utopia possible? I don't think a utopia is possible.
So I'll let Chad answer this one.
Yeah, I don't know. It's tricky. So are you saying like to what extent have they experienced it? Is because I don't know. There's been, I feel like you can experience it and then you can still go back from it. You can still kind of go back to that.
Yeah. But we've already
ignorance.
established that.
But
the
you're
thing is,
saying
the
that
thing is, like, you can go back into the ignorance in terms of behavior,
sure.
Not in
but
state.
not in state, because state leads to behavior,
That's-
but not in sense of like it's stuck in your memory.
So
in
like
some
the
sense,
seed
like,
is still there.
The seed, the experience is still there. It's like I can never not skydive again. Like Dylan,
Yeah. And so, yeah, some people will probably, a lot of people will probably lead a much virtuous, a life of kind of, because I think when you experience that consciousness and you realize that, oh, life is suffering, and then there is a way to reduce that suffering, I think one thing that also awakens, and I think there was an earlier thing mentioned here about the teacher, like, why is the teacher trying to push this framework out into the world? It's that when you realize that my life is suffering and I can reduce that, you realize that, well, other people's life is also suffering. And in the same way I'm trying to liberate my Atma, other people can also be liberated in the same way. And the net suffering in the world would be reduced. So I guess where I'm going with is, if people had that taste of consciousness, there would be probably more people walking that path of trying to understand themselves and try to reduce the suffering in their lives. But I think you'd also have a society of people trying to help each other more, trying to be of service and trying to help each other also reduce that suffering. And I think, to me, that's what utopia is. It's when people actually work together for the betterment of all. And often that's what I feel like our society, sometimes that's where we fall short. It's that problem of collective action where we
can I just interject, because I'm playing the contrarian, the devil's advocate here, right? If the universal truth is that everything in life is misery, then how can the concept of utopia exist? That's what I'm trying to understand here, is that like what you're saying.
I think what he's saying is that a utopia is not a world without suffering.
Right.
A utopia is where the members that exist in the world recognize each other's suffering and do their part to reduce it.
I personally take this kind of like a bit more of a, like, not a cynical way, but like my like understanding of like not just history but just in general of life, right? Mm-hmm. I believe that if every person at some point has experienced enlightenment, we'd all fall across this one universal spectrum where each person would kind of take their own take on it. Like we talked earlier about the concept that, enlightenment is this state where you understand everything, but then once you return from it, you then give your own take on what that truth was to encourage other people to go on that path, right?
So you're saying essentially it's the same state.
No, hear me out on this.
But people, once they come down from there, their own interpretation warps.
Yeah, so like
states.
they've left the transcendental state, and now they're back onto the material ego plane, right? Okay. So you can't explain the transcendental state to someone that hasn't experienced it, right? So you have to give a material explanation, or not even a material explanation, a material method for them to be able to understand that, right? But what I'm saying here is that they've taken their own traits, they've taken their own takes on it, right? But what I don't think that there is a society, a human society, if every single person is truly enlightened. Because what inevitably happens is that the outliers of society are the ones who take it to the absolute extreme. There are people that will view that, their take on the truth will be that human destruction is unfathomable. We must end all of humanity as a result of it. Like some people... And this is what I'm trying to say, is that like some people on the outliers of society will then take that will push society in towards perhaps the next evolution, which might be just the destruction of society as a whole. So that's what I'm trying to say, is that like if we were all enlightened, like hypothetically every person had that experience of enlightenment, I think that there would be people that would take that and then would ideally create this world, like would essentially push it to the point of no return. And that's where I think like we've come to today, because there were people like Americans who overestimated, who didn't give a shit about. But
they haven't destroyed society. Society still exists.
But like society exists, but like the essence of what society is, the collective connection of us as like us. Like, yes, you're a human being. Yes, Chet, you're a human being. But what I'm saying is the connection, that connection with each member as a whole, like, is broken, because now we have found a way to create a separate nucleus. Like, there are two.
No.
There are two states.
That's hydrogen. Like, doesn't only exist with deuterium. Like, you can just have hydrogen on its own as well.
No, but like what I'm trying to say here is that like that's what Vipassana teaches you, is that you disassociate, like you create another self, like you create your ego self and you create your own sense of.
Essentially, what you're saying is you're in control of both. Actually, no. You can only be in control of one.
No, so what I am trying to say is that if hypothetically everyone was enlightened, then I think that eventually there would be someone who, I don't know on what side of the spectrum is, but they would not consider the morality of humanity to be important, because they've decided that like whatever the reason is, and they've pushed that button to then decide that, okay, this is the next form of dissolution. Like, the way that I think about it is like it's constantly dividing, and that's where change and flux occurs, because this constant form of dissolution is happening in everything. We're always going to get like atoms smaller than apples, smaller than even atoms themselves. Like, that's what I'm trying to say, is that it's going to, like, we don't have an understanding of that because we're always finite minded in that sense. But like, what I'm trying to say is that like everything will constantly just then evolve to just chaos, like just as is.
Do you think it would go full circle if we were all enlightened? Eventually, we'd all be unenlightened. Like that'd be like the new baseline, and then we'd work from.
And then
there.
the next creation
like
of
maybe
what,
like in terms of evolution, you know, when we came from the last whatever creature we were in like a lower state, and then we all got enlightened and we were at this state,
exactly,
and then that became our new baseline,
exactly,
and now we're gonna rise to the next one, and then that will still be the next baseline,
exactly,
and continue.
That's what it is, right?
I think it's possible, but I think I also disagree with that. It will lead to destruction. Like, I think part of this enlightenment thing is you're trying to like there's these concepts of like chaos and order, and I think enlightenment is trying to reduce that chaos, both with like starting within yourself, but then also going outward as well. And I feel like it is almost mutually exclusive for someone who is enlightened to be like, I want to destroy the world.
And also,
but I feel like how it could end society might be that if everyone's enlightened, people would be like, well, why do we need to continue propagating as a human species?
Well, does that goes back into like what your experience of enlightenment is, right? If your experience of enlightenment is this one eternal self that is not, you know, obviously not human, that has no human traits, nirguna brahman as is known, if we all essentially merge into that with our experience, then after that, if we don't have sex and there are no more humans, does Nirguna Brahman exist? The answer is yes, because it's already existed with or without us.
Yeah. So in the material sense,
do you need a human being for this to be true?
Yeah. So in the material sense, I feel like humans might just like, we have an attachment to our, you know, our legacy and stuff, and like, you know, wanting to reproduce. I feel like being enlightened, you would lose that attachment. You wouldn't feel the need to reproduce. And if everyone is enlightened, I feel like effectively, like even one of the things that was taught is like even sex itself kind of goes against, you know, the path to liberation, because you're generating passion, and that's why monks go celibate, to kind of that itself is there's this attachment that's created in that process.
There are at this point.
I just think
you should mention before continuing from what he just said. It should be mentioned at this point that this view of enlightenment is a very specific view of enlightenment. There are many different types of enlightenment, once again, because people define it slightly differently. The householder's view of enlightenment, which is let's say the Gita view, and this might be the Shramana view, which is like the ascetic view. They're slightly different. So the Shramana view is very much like let go of everything and then eventually you'll be nothing. The Jainas are very, very strict on this. The Jain people, not the Jain like society, but like the Jain monks anyway. Whereas there's not necessarily this in like the other
detachment
views the detachment of like every single thing.
Okay.
It's slightly different. What were you going to say?
I think like, Okay, I like you guys are like I think my take on this is that like I'm trying to like it's okay. I'm trying to zoom out as much as possible. Like I'm seeing beyond just our humanity. Like I'm seeing beyond say like because like our only comprehension of like the shadow or like sorry, not the shadow, but like our understanding is that there is a metaphysical plane. So like I was telling you earlier, right? Like the concept if that everybody had ingrained with them that there is a metaphysical plane, then to some degree that becomes the baseline, right? So then if you extend that, right, if the next evolution of what we become then understands that, what stops them from then exploring the next layer of truth, which we don't
nothing. Well, we
but
don't
that's
know
what
that
I'm
yet,
that's
right?
what I'm
So-
trying to say is that like there is like the truth of what things are is just based off the moment that we have and what we think of it right now. So the next layer may then use this understanding of the metaphysical plane, then think to themselves,
And go
I'm
further.
going to explore
Yeah.
universes, and then I'm going to find that there is no metaphysical plane,
Yeah.
and I'm going to dissolve that. And then what's like the point is that it's all still going.
I mean, it's all, to be fair, all of this is still conjecture. But this entire topic is in the realm of conjecture. So to end, though, I do want to give a nice little story based on Chet's view of utopia. This is a Korean Christian story of a man that goes to heaven and then he also goes to hell.
Okay.
So when he goes to hell, there's food everywhere, there's people everywhere. Everyone's, eating, and he's like, whoa, this is hell? What's going on? Everyone's sort of just eating, there's bounty, there's everything. And then he goes to heaven. And when he goes to heaven, same thing, there's food everywhere, but there's just, the spoons are massive. And he's like, wait, how are people supposed to eat? But then he realizes, when he sees the people in heaven, people are feeding each other with these long spoons. So that's utopia, that's heaven.
Helping each other.
Thinking about the other person.
I think, I agree with that. And I think the moment in which humanity stops, like, I think where it becomes truly that, I think, I think that in itself it becomes the end. And I think that's a great way to think about it,
Yeah. So
Come full
takeaway is go meditate, save yourself, and save others in the process.
And get big spoons for your house so you can feed the
spoons.
family.
Big spoons, little servings. That's it.
All right, thanks guys. See you next time.
See ya.
Cool. Bye.